I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the 116th meeting of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration in the 42nd Parliament. Pursuant to Standing Order 106.4, meeting requested by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request to undertake a study of federal government's response to the impact of increased asylum seekers crossing into Canada from the United States. Bienvenue à tous.
Welcome to everyone.
Just to set the context for this meeting, Ms. Rempel.
That's all right. I just wanted to get on the speaker's list.
Oh. You're on. Just to set the context for the meeting, as people know under the standing orders, if any 4 members of a committee request a meeting of a standing committee to be held, it must be held within 5 days of the request being received by the clerk, and 48 hours notice needs to be given of that said meeting. And so this meeting is in response to the request of 4 members who have a specific agenda item they'd like to bring today. And our meeting, while it is doing business of the committee, is not the same as our other business meetings, and we will be restricted to dealing with the topic at hand, which the 4 members of the committee have requested we deal with. And the suspicion is that we will entertain a notice of motion that has been already given, and I'm going to turn to Ms. Rempel to begin that. And Ms. Kwan is on the speaker's list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just as a point of clarification, so based on your comments, my understanding is that you have achieved consensus that the matter at hand in the letter that was expressed to you or sent to you would be accepted.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I want to lay out my rationale on why we're requesting this meeting and why I think it's really important for us to have a study prior to the House sitting in the fall, and why I think it's important for us to have the minister attend, and why it's important that we actually have 2 meetings so that we can have other witnesses. And my preference would be that we extend the opportunity to some of our provincial counterparts to get on the record some of their needs with the situation. So I'm going to try and do this in as non-partisan manner as possible, because I hope we can get consensus at the committee today. So I feel that Canada's immigration system should be planned, it should be orderly, and it should be compassionate. Mr. Chair, for clarification, you will entertain my notice of motion today, and you will find that in order. Great.
If you'd like to present it at the start,
sure.
That's very much in order. Okay,
thank you. So I will move the motion which I have given notice for, that pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration undertake a study to review the adequacy of the federal government's response to the impact of increased asylum seekers crossing into Canada from the United States, that the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship appear before the committee for the purposes of this study, and this study be comprised of at least 2 meetings, and this study be completed no later than August the 3rd, 2018. I am moving this motion today because evidence has mounted that Canada's immigration system has taken a marked departure from the principle of being run in a planned, orderly, and compassionate manner. And as parliamentarians, we have a responsibility to hold the government to account on this point for the sake of those seeking to come to Canada, newcomers to Canada, and for Canadian taxpayers. I ask for your support in this motion, and will lay out my evidence for the statement I've just made, as well as the rationale as to why it's critical that we have these meetings as soon as possible. I think that regardless of our political affiliation, I would hope that we would agree that managing a compassionate humanitarian system means ensuring that Canada is prioritizing the world's most vulnerable in our resettlement efforts. I also hope that we would all agree that it means that those coming to Canada are encouraged to and supported into integrating into the social and economic fabric of our country. This means ensuring that newcomers learn one of Canada's official languages so that they do not experience long-term inclusion issues, that they are able to overcome any trauma they experienced in fleeing their home countries, and that they are able to acquire skills and find gainful employment and contribute as productive members of our community. In all of these points, as parliamentarians, we cannot allow long-term reliance on social supports to become the norm or an acceptable path for humanitarian immigrants. We can also not allow our humanitarian immigration system to become overburdened by those who will never have their asylum claims validated. If this happens, we will see an increased strain on Canada's social supports and decreased tolerance for immigration in Canada writ large. This is something that, again, regardless of political stripe, I would hope that none of us on this committee would desire to occur. In the context of a country with a generous social welfare system like Canada, it takes a high degree of planning and budgeting to make this happen. It takes data and constant monitoring of the processes related to the selection, screening, and then support of humanitarian immigrants. The instinct of some of you, especially those of you in the Liberal caucus, might be to become defensive and suggest that Canada isn't at risk of this happening. There's nothing wrong with Canada's system at present. But before you do, I would ask you to take a step back and reflect on some of the following data points. And I ask you to do so with open minds. And as parliamentarians that do not have government appointments and as such have a primary responsibility to hold the government to account for its decisions, regardless of political affiliation. I will start my argument by providing some important context on the capacity of our system to successfully respond to the issue that is occurring at Roxham Road. Since early 2016, Canada has resettled nearly 50,000 Syrian refugees. This was a massive initiative that was well above the usual year-over-year humanitarian immigration numbers that Canada plans for in its immigration levels plan. In testimony to our committee in 2016, many people from the Syrian refugee cohort and those related to the resettlement efforts stated that Syrian refugees came from primarily rural agrarian backgrounds, had literacy challenges in their first language, suffered trauma from war, did not have large amounts of formal education, and as such would face more integration challenges in the context of Canada's developed economy than previous cohorts of humanitarian immigrants. In short, this cohort of people had a lot of complex needs that required intense planning and budgeting in order to ensure that they successfully integrate into Canada. In 2016, this committee studied the needs of resettlement service providers following the Syrian initiative and heard from provincial and municipal leaders that the lack of additional resettlement services funding or any transfers to provincial health and education system made it difficult to adequately plan for or monitor the integration of the Syrian refugee cohort into Canadian society. Indeed, today, Federal Auditor General Michael Ferguson expressed his extreme concern in the government's failure to provide transparent progress reports on the integration of Syrian refugees into Canada. We have no data on how many are employed, how many have learned one of Canada's official language, or the cost of providing social welfare programs to these nearly 50,000 people. The last time the minister provided an update to this committee on this issue was well over a year ago, and at that time he stated 90% of the government-sponsored Syrian refugees were unemployed. Since then, the one-year funding provided by the federal government has expired, and based on this data that he provided, it is reasonable to suggest that many of the Syrian cohort will be drawing income from provincial social welfare programs. Further, many IRCC staff were at the time redirected to processing applications of Syrian refugees. This context is important to consider in relation to the motion at hand because prior to the influx of asylum seekers who had already reached the United States, Canada's system was struggling to adapt to the processing and integration needs of the Syrian cohort. You don't have to take my word for it. Many of you heard from resettlement services providers and from Syrian refugees themselves at this committee when we studied the issue in 2016. Then January 2017 happened. In January 2017, the Americans issued an executive order related to their immigration policy. In an unprompted response that has been since described as a holier-than-thou response by a National Post columnist, Canada's Prime Minister sent out a tweet that prompted tens of thousands of people to use a loophole in an agreement that we have with the United States that prevents asylum claim shopping to illegally cross the border from the United States into Canada and subsequently claim asylum. Again, you don't have to take my word on this. Media reports have shown the flurry of memos between embassies and the IRCC showing that this tweet was viewed as an open invitation to come to Canada. The number of people who have made this journey since January 2017 is 31,377. This is the highest level of unplanned immigration in recent Canadian history. And it is unplanned because it blows the government predictions for asylum seekers outlined in its immigration levels plan out of the water. In no scenario presented to Parliament or to this committee has the Minister or the Prime Minister laid out a scenario in which they have planned for tens of thousands of people to enter Canada via this method. Since then, as parliamentarians, we have no idea how much the government at the federal level has spent on tents, RCMP and CBSA overtime, transport, accommodation, new staffs, consultants, ministerial travel, and on related to the crisis at Roxham Road. We also have no idea how much the provincial governments have been required to spend on welfare, subsidized housing, emergency housing, food banks, education, daycare, healthcare, and other costs related to those crossing at Roxham Road. We also have no idea how much the government is planning on having to spend on the eventual removals of those found to have non-valid asylum claims. We know that the Immigration Refugee Board is at a crisis point, with internal memos suggesting that it will take years for someone who enters Roxham Road today to even have their refugee claim heard, which makes calculating the long-term impact on federal and provincial social programs budgets that's much more difficult. As parliamentarians, the government has provided us with no information on the expected needs of those crossing at Roxham Road. Do they speak one of Canada's official languages? Are they capable of working? Do they have skill sets that will meet the labour market demands of Canada's economy? And if so, will they settle in regions where those skills are needed? How is the government planning on ensuring that this will happen? Will this impact other immigration streams? We also have no information from the government on how many people they expect to illegally cross from Canada from the United States and subsequently claim asylum in the coming years and months. Rather, they have begun to use language that normalizes over 1,000 people entering Canada this way per month, which is an exceptionally large increase from recent history. For example, the minister recently tweeted out statistics that show an increase in June numbers year over year from 2017 to 2018 and suggested that this was a decrease in demand. At this point, it's becoming apparent to me that the government has done little analysis on the entire issue. This is even more concerning because the government has not expressed any desire to explore legislative options to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, but suggests that they are content to allow the demand on our system to begin a permanent phenomenon. And indeed, today, I would suggest that the government has made a policy decision to normalize this situation. I know that we all diverge on policy approaches with regard to the Safe Third Country Agreement, and I respect that. I will, however, say I find it unacceptable that we are allowing people who have already reached the United States of America, one of the most free democracies in the world, regardless of who occupies the White House, to claim asylum in Canada via a loophole in an agreement that, by the government's own admission, by the Prime Minister's own admission in the House of Commons, is still valid. I believe that by failing to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, the government has made a formal policy decision to normalize tens of thousands of people illegally crossing the border from the United States, and this has not been reflected in any immigration levels plan or formal budgetary process. Regardless of how you feel about this decision, on if it's right or not, it has been made, and Canadians now need information on how much this will cost them and how people will be integrated into Canada. This situation has been occurring for over a year and a half. It is irresponsible for us as parliamentarians to allow the government to piecemeal allocate hundreds of millions of dollars outside of the budgetary cycle when they've known for 18 months that this is an issue and didn't address it in a federal budget or estimates process. It is irresponsible for us to allow them to spend this money, piecemeal or not, without understanding the assumptions the government has based these decisions on, as I've outlined above. It is irresponsible for us to allow them to spend this money without discussing the opportunity cost of this decision. The federal government is already running billions of dollars in deficit, and this allocation of funds could be used to increase the processing efficacy of other immigration streams for those legally seeking to enter the country via the PSR stream, family reunification, and others. These funds could also be used to provide social supports for Canadians. Canadians need this information because if they don't have it, then they will lose faith in the ability of the government to run an immigration system that benefits the country and those who are most in need. They also need this information right now, before hundreds of people are turned out of homeless shelters on August the 9th, and before the House sits again in September. We're months away from the estimates process, and the government is making significant unbudgeted funding announcements without any of this information provided to Parliament, while they know that this has been an issue for over 18 months. I'd like to thank Mr. Maguire for requesting that the Parliamentary Budget Officer conduct a system-wide review of the federal government's expenditures on the Roxham Road crisis, and it's my understanding that the Parliamentary Budget Officer has agreed to this request. Given departments like the CBSA and IRCC have been late on or delinquent on questions raised by parliamentarians in committee in this regard, I would also like the opportunity to ask the Minister if he intends to direct his department to fully comply with the PBO's inquiry. We also need to learn how the government intends to prioritize those crossing at Roxham Road after already having reached the United States in the context of ethnic cleansing happening to the Rohingya people, persecuted minorities languishing in UN refugee camps in the Middle East, and more. There are so many demands on us from agencies such as UNHCR to take more government-sponsored refugees, and now that the government has made a policy decision to normalize what is happening at Roxham Road and not close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, we need to understand how this is going to affect other resettlement requests on our system. We also need to understand directly from the provinces what their needs are and what their expectations are for federal government support before we can assess whether or not the federal government's response is adequate. Based on what happened in Winnipeg on Friday, I don't think that the government's line that this is a team effort and we expect the provinces to just pick it up without understanding this data and seeing a long-term plan that's reflected in both the levels plan and our budgetary process is going to cut it any longer. In fact, I think it's irresponsible, both for people who are entering Canada and to Canadian taxpayers. According to a recent poll published in a Canadian newspaper, 70% of Canadians saying that they are saying that they don't feel that the federal government has an adequate plan to address this issue. We need these meetings now. We do not need them in September, and they need to have the minister here. Asking these questions of a government and ensuring that they have a plan that addresses all of these answered questions is the most Canadian thing that any of us sitting around this table could do. Look, Canada is unique in that all of our major political parties support immigration. We diverge on how that happens, but the reality is that in Canada in the last 18 months, we've seen a marked departure from normal immigration processes. And the government has made, by default or ignoring it or whatever, a significant policy change in refusing to look at legislative options to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. #Welcome to Canada has changed our humanitarian immigration system. And we do not have any of the data that I outlined here, and it is starting to bear very negative fruit. All of the concerns that I raised, we can differ on policy options, but the government needs to respond to these questions now. You know, the last few days, I've seen some really disappointing things come out of the Prime Minister's office, you know, calling an Ontario cabinet minister who's in charge of women's services alt-right because she's asking this question. Look, we can disagree on policy. We're not disagreeing on if immigration. We're just asking questions on how the government intends to do it. And it's not going to cut it for us to meet again at the end of September, because we know this minister is going to have to commit a significant amount of money to the provinces in order to just cover some of the concerns that are being raised by Mayor John Tory or Mayor Watson. As parliamentarians, we don't hold executive positions in government. Our job is to hold the government to account. And I know it might be difficult for Liberal colleagues to do that, but I ask that in order to get back to what we're supposed to be doing with the Immigration Committee, that we have the minister here and that we really subject him to some rigor on these questions. The government's response, even just in providing information, has been completely inadequate, and we also now need to hear from the provincial governments. Many of our provincial governments are in significant deficit situations. Many of our provincial governments are in positions where they have raised taxes, and I'm really worried about that 70% figure, because that 70% figure is something that could easily translate into a loss of social license in Canada for our humanitarian immigration system. And as somebody who has argued for the government to bring refugees to Canada, I don't want to see that happen. So I would hope that in the next week at a minimum, that we could have the minister here, that he would comport himself with dignity and with the respect of parliamentarians to answer some of these questions, and we would have an opportunity for our provincial counterparts to do the same. And then over the summer, over the fall session, we can start to hold the government to account for the need to have a more cohesive plan to address these issues. I don't find it fun to go out in front of a microphone in a scrum after the minister goes out every second week and is announcing $50 million here, $100 million here. I had to respond to the Liberals' plan, to the government's plan to put people, to quote-unquote triage people, put people who have crossed at Roxham Road and put them on a bus to Toronto. And then now that the homeless shelter capacity in Toronto is oversubscribed, to put them on a bus to parts unknown. These are people's lives. I mean, the reports that are coming out of the IRB about it taking years for claims to be processed. I mean, that's wrong because for so many reasons, because a quick and efficient IRB process, if the demand on the system was lower, I think would prevent some of this from happening. But the reality is the government has made a policy decision that is going to keep the demand on IRC really high for a long period of time. And we have to ask ourselves as parliamentarians, is appointing an entire and setting up an entire expanded bureaucracy for people, many of whom will not have valid asylum claims, the best use of taxpayer money? I might argue no, others might argue yes, but we need to have that discussion if the government is not going to close the loophole in the agreement, which is where we're at. I also think that that type of a system really is detrimental to people who have come to Canada, because they are, you know, how do you put down roots and get a job if it's going to take 7 years for you to have your asylum process claimed? Look, we've had the minister before committee before. I questioned him for 4 hours in the committee of the whole, and we still don't have a plan. The summer, we need to do this right now. We can't wait for 2.5 months. And, you know, through you, Mr. Chair, to all of my colleagues, regardless of political stripe, let's at least get the minister here, and let's at least have our provincial counterparts sit down so that we can start doing our job as parliamentarians and fixing the crisis situation that we're in right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I turn to Ms. Kwan, who's next on the list, I just want to remind folks that there are some people that think that we will be doing a study today. I know that that word got out there. The meeting today is about doing a study, just to get that clear, and that the rules of procedure for calling meetings and calling witnesses will if the committee decides to have meetings, will fall into place. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I first like to thank all the committee members that are here who's interrupted their constituency time and time with the family over the summer. I do think that this is important work, and that's why I agreed to call for this meeting, Mr. Chair. The situation that we're faced with is a situation that I think we saw coming, frankly. At least for me, in January of 2017, when the Trump administration, one of the first acts when Trump became president was to bring forward the travel ban. And you'll recall, Mr. Chair and committee members, that right off the bat, we resumed back into the House of Commons, and I had moved an emergency debate at that time. The Speaker granted that emergency debate, and we had a robust debate about the situation. And at that time, I proposed 5 different suggestions on how to address the situation. And so to that end, I'm going to touch on some of those issues because I still think that some of those suggestions that were presented at that time is relevant to the situation today. What we saw was, of course, the Trump administration, every time he brought in some policy that frankly were racist and discriminatory and targeted a particular community, we saw a reaction. And we saw a reaction, and Canada was impacted and has been impacted and continue to be impacted in that regard. We also have a situation now whereby I think at the moment when the Prime Minister tweeted out how Canada welcome asylum seekers, how we welcome the faces of the world, I, as a parliamentarian, as a Canadian, as an immigrant who came to this country, I have to tell you, I was very proud of that moment. Notwithstanding that I was NDP, that I am NDP, I was proud of that moment for the Prime Minister to have done that. What was needed, though, I will say, is to follow action, to ensure that you match your action with your words. Because when you don't, I think we have the situation that's before us right now. First off, I want to address this issue. This has bothered me for some time, and people continue to use terminologies that misrepresents the situation. And I think it's unfortunate. People insist on calling asylum seekers illegals. And I have to tell you, once again, Mr. Chair, that asylum seekers are not illegals. Under the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, it clearly states when a person crosses over to Canada at an irregular border crossing, that they are not committing a criminal offense. I think it is so important that it's incumbent on all of us not to play politics by using terminology that does not help the situation. When you paint a person as an illegal, you set in the minds and the hearts of people that somehow those people should have no right to be here in Canada, when in fact that is not true. Canada signed onto the UN Convention and Protocol for Refugees, and as long as we are a signatory to those conventions, We do have our borders open, and asylum seekers who come to seek safety, they are not illegals. So I just want to say that very clearly to the people who insist on using this terminology. I ask them to please, to cease and desist, because that kind of use of language does not help the situation. It is not helpful for the asylum seekers. It is not helpful to Canada. It is not helpful to the people who are in dire situations, vulnerable children who need to get to safety. And it is not good for the future of Canada, where I say over and over again, and to which I am so proud of Canada, to have learned from our mistakes of the past, of discriminatory policies of the past, to get to where we are today, where we value and cherish the diversity of Canada. I say this all the time, every Canada Day, July 1st. I say this all the time. We are the faces of the world, and we welcome them. We welcome every single person, no matter who they are, where they come from. We welcome them, and we acknowledge that they contribute to Canada's multicultural mosaic, economically, culturally, politically, in every realm. It is the contribution. So I ask people to choose your words carefully and not to paint people in a way that, frankly, misrepresents the situation. The other issue that I want to touch on is this. We argue about this. You know, part of the issue is the asylum seekers coming over from the United States through irregular crossings. That is the key issue to which we're faced with today. Why are people doing that? They are doing that because of Trump, I believe. And second, they are forced to cross over irregularly because of the Safe Third Country Agreement. Let us just be clear about that. And when that happens, it impacts the border communities. We have a situation where we're constantly just trying to do an ad hoc approach, flying by the seat of our pants, if you will, is what the government's doing to try to address the situation. I think we can do better. I really do. If you look at the situation, and my colleague, the member from Calgary-Nose Hill, insists that the United States is a safe country. Really? I have to ask this question. How could anybody think that the United States is a safe country when we're witnessing what's happening today? First, the travel ban, and then, not very long ago, we were all in this house when we saw it happen, where the president literally brought in a policy and acted on it by ripping children away from their parents, throwing them in cages, locking up the parents, and somehow think that is okay. Under what planet is that a safe country for anyone? When you show up at that border and you're seeking safety, and the first thing that happens to you is someone comes to you and take away your children. You do not know where they're being taken to. You don't know when you will see them again. How is this a safe country? It is in violation, as we already know, of every single international law that you can possibly imagine. It is in violation of human rights. It is in violation of the rights of children. The most sacred thing that I think we as humanity have to honor. Children. And that this is happening. It's happened. Now, yes, the U.S. has suspended it for the moment, but what next? And in the meantime, 2,000 children have been separated. And we're reading stories, even just today, stories that's come up about how the children's been impacted, how even they've been reunited with their parents, the vacant faces, the damage that has already been done. We can only imagine what that would be like. So how on earth can we say the United States is a safe country? It is beyond me. And it's not about politics. It is about people. It is about vulnerable people. It is about children. It's about families. It's about humanity. That's what this is all about. So we need to step up. Canada needs to step up. I have called for Canada to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement over and over and over again. right from day one, since January of 2017, and I continue to ask the government to do so. I was disturbed to read in the news, to hear the minister contemplate the very thing that the Conservative members are suggesting, their only solution, which is to take a page out of the Trump administration and to shut down our border to asylum seekers by declaring all 9,000 kilometers of the Canadian border with the Safe Third Country Agreement. The minister himself was contemplating this by using biometrics. I was shocked and dismayed to hear that, but there we are. So I would say that we need to look at this issue. We need to look at the issue around whether or not the United States is a safe country. And I would argue that it isn't, because it does impact the asylum-seeking issues related to Canada. I would say that, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, on the issue around processing, and let's be honest about this, there has been chronic underfunding with the IRB, with successive governments, with the Liberals, with the Conservatives, and now with the Liberals. There's been chronic underfunding, and the IRB has been jammed with the lack of resources. The lack of resources is so acute that, to the credit of this government, when they came on, they tried to address the legacy cases, which were left over from the Conservatives. About 5,000 cases. To their credit, they tried to address it. The only problem is that they took existing resources to address the legacy cases. Robbing Peter to pay Paul does not solve the problem. But the government did that. And hence, we now have added pressure with the irregular crossings, but with no real additional resources until this budget, until this 2018 budget, where the government put some money in and is deficient. Is deficient to address the issue properly. We heard not very long ago at a study right here at the committee from the, on studying the IRB on the complaint process, where the interim chair came to committee and said that even on vacancies, filling vacancies was a challenge for them. Why? Because they only have interim funding for 2 years. That's it. And they said it's hard to attract talent to come to the table because people know that it's not going to carry on. Who would give up their other job to actually commit to this position when you know that it's only a temporary situation? And that does not help the problem. The government just came forward with a study, a consultant report on the IRB. And we saw on the IRB about the need for efficiencies. Well, we need to address the issue of efficiencies with the IRB. We need to resource the IRB so we can address this issue properly. And we also need to look at government policies that create additional backlog. And there are government policies that's counterproductive to the work of the IRB, and that actually jams up the IRB further. We're at the risk excuse me. We're at risk if we don't see resources put to the IRB, seeing what I would say legacy cases 2.0. That is what's going to happen if we don't deal with this effectively. And I do hope that we will look at this issue, Mr. Chair. On the question around the numbers, and the numbers are important. I have heard people say that we do not have a stream within our immigration system to address the irregular crossings. That is not true, Mr. Chair. We do have a stream in our immigration system to address that. And that is the protected persons stream, Mr. Chair. The protected persons in Canada and dependents abroad class stipulates in the levels plan, the 2018 levels plan, that we would accommodate 16,000 individuals in that category. and that includes the irregular crossers. Now, I will say this, though, that the number in the levels plan is deficient to address the situation today. What is needed is for us to look at the levels plan and to amend it accordingly to address the situation, to deal with the situation with what's happening today. Because if you don't, then you will allow for those who will want to say that asylum seekers are somehow queue jumping, that asylum seekers are taking away the opportunities for government-assisted refugees to come to Canada, for example, for immigrants to immigrate to Canada, for example. You will allow for that argument to continue and to fuel the misrepresentation and to create the kind of fear in the hearts and minds of people. And I don't think that's useful or helpful for anyone at all. And I think it is important to address that issue in a concrete way, in a way to which the levels plan allows for in moving forward. And then, when we look at the issue around resourcing, we have now deteriorated into a situation where you have the provincial minister bickering with the minister, with our federal minister, the Minister of Immigration, resorting to name-calling, and all of that, frankly, is also not useful and helpful. What we need for the government to do is to sit down, seriously look at the situation. The fact of the matter is that with the increase in asylum seekers, there has been an impact for provincial governments and municipal governments. And that we need to look at how we can deal with that in an effective way, not in an ad hoc way, as we have seen, because what the government did in the beginning, we saw the first influx came in Manitoba, in the dead of winter, when people cross over risking life and limb to come to Canada for safety. And then there was an impact for the local communities, for the border communities, and they were trying to manage the situation. The government came to the table late in the day to try and address that and didn't provide the necessary resources to them. I traveled to the border in Manitoba last summer, and I talked to the NGOs there on the ground. They told me that they were still short on the money that they had put out to address the asylum seekers. The federal government never compensated them for that effort, and I think that's wrong. I do. And then we saw the situation in Quebec, and the Quebec provincial government came to the federal government's table and asked for resources, and now we see the same thing going on with Ontario. Clearly, there needs to be additional resources. The $50 million, at the time when the government made that announcement, I supported it, but said right then and there that I predict that it was not going to be sufficient to address the issue, because this is an ongoing problem and that we need to come up with a plan to deal with the situation into the long term. But there wasn't one. There wasn't one, and here we are again. It's like history is repeating itself and we don't learn from it, then we will just keep on generating this kind of situation that people would want to create the misrepresentation and the misinformation that will continue to be out there in the broader community. And again, that is not good for the asylum seekers, it's not good for government, it's not good for anyone, Mr. Chair. I would say that with this study, time is of the essence. The longer we wait, the longer we delay in coming up with a fulsome plan to recommend to the government, the longer this situation will prevail. And constantly then, you're chasing the tail and you're constantly trying to address issues of misrepresentation and to create the confusion that is out there and to create a sense of panic or crisis, as some people would call it. From my perspective, this situation can be managed and should be managed effectively. And hence, you need to put in all the components that's important. that I had mentioned earlier. And the last piece that I would throw in there that I say would be important to address is to look at an international strategy to deal with the situation. And that includes how we work with our allies in the international community to address the problems that Trump is creating with his immigration policies. Canada is a middle power country. We have worked so hard for so long to earn this reputation, to be fair-minded, to be a compassionate country, to be a country that advocates for peace, to be able to broker deals, to be able to assert an important voice in the international stage. And I think that we need to add that component to the study for us to look at this, to come up with a strategy to address the source of the issue, the source of the problem, and that being the Trump administration. Much is at stake here. Canada's reputation is at stake here. The integrity of Canada's immigration system is at stake here. If we don't do this right, I fear that we would live to regret it. And if we don't address these issues, then Canada would be complicit. If we shut down our border, as my conservative colleagues have suggested, by applying the Safe Third Country Agreement to the entire border of Canada, then we are complicit to the situation that we're faced with by the asylum seekers. Asylum seekers who are fleeing to the United States because of gang violence will not be able to do so because the Trump administration has already declared that they will not accept asylum seekers fleeing gang violence as a legitimate asylum claim. That is in violation of international laws, is in violation of gender-related persecution laws. We know that a large segment of asylum seekers from Central America have this issue that they're faced with, and that is the basis of their asylum claim, and has been for the United States to outright declare that they won't accept those asylum claims clearly indicates that there's a problem here. So, Mr. Chair, I do support a study. I do support the motion to call for the minister to come before the committee and for the officials to come before the committee and for witnesses to be called to come before the committee. And I hope that that conversation will be more of an approach that takes a collaborative approach to say that let's put all the ideas on the table, let's fairly evaluate them with the goal of effectively addressing the issue that is in accordance to international laws that we are a signatory to. That would be a way forward. And then to also say that resources are needed, that we do not eliminate the question of resources on the table, but to look at that and examine it fully to see what resources are necessary to address this issue in a fair and adequate way. And finally, Mr. Chair, people will say that there is a humanitarian crisis across the globe, and they are right. The UN has reported that there are close to 70 million people that are displaced. The numbers in which Canada are taking in at the moment, even if you include the Syrian Refugee Initiative of the 50,000, which, by the way, we haven't actually brought in the entire 50,000, notwithstanding, close enough. Even if you include the 50,000 and all the other streams, our contribution to this humanitarian crisis is only 0.1%, Mr. Chair. So in that context, Canada is doing something, but we're just doing a little bit of something. So let us open our hearts and open our minds with this approach. Let us see the situation for what it is and the problems that's being created as a result of the United States, and come up with wholesome solutions and be part of the solution to the issue and not create further problems, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Nandasangari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues. Of course, I think we're all delighted to be back here in this very warm day because I think we missed each other. We haven't seen each other in a while. Of course, Mr. Tilson, no doubt. But I just want to address, in broader terms, this issue that we've been discussing now for well over a year, at least since the time I've been on this committee. This May, on May 22nd, we passed a motion to study this issue during the summer. I know that was passed by consensus by all parties. Therefore, there's no question that this is an important issue that everyone wants to discuss and to be able to work out. But it's important to understand that as a government, as a minister, there's been extensive engagement on this issue. There's been a plan from the outset, and it's a plan that develops over time, and that's what we've seen in the last 2.5 years. It's a plan that has evolved, commensurate with what's been happening at our border. If we look at our committee alone, we have discussed this issue on 5 separate occasions since last year. 5 separate occasions we've had discussions. Our minister has appeared here on 6 different occasions, if I'm not mistaken, to outline the work that he's done, and the major part of the work and the questions that was asked of him were related to the border crossings. And if we look at May 24th, that's the day we had a Committee of the Whole where Minister Hussein spoke extensively to Parliament on many aspects of this issue. If you look at the staff, the enormous work the staff have done, because every time they come to committee, they're given piles of homework, and they have continuously responded to every single request that's made of us, or a vast majority of the requests. Some may be still outstanding, but my recollection of it is that vast majority of the requests that's made by individual members are responded to by the staff. So therefore, there's extensive information. The plan is quite clear. And notwithstanding this, there has been a culture, and frankly and sadly, a very concentrated effort of misinformation. And Ms. Kwan, I fully endorse your assessment of the use of language in this context. It's very important. I think it's very easy to vilify people, and I think that's what we've already done in some respect because of the type of language that has been used by many around government, many around our opposition, and I think that's been harmful, and that's going to have irreparable harm for the individuals who are actually here. And if we look at the debate that's ongoing, it is one that is really divisive. I don't think it's constructive. It's divisive based on the politics of fear. We are othering those who are coming here. We've gone through this process a number of different times in our country's history, and I don't think it's been helpful. I don't think it's been helpful when we circle a group of people and say they're undesirable, they're illegal, they're not welcome here. And I think it's a very dangerous road that we're taking. It's a very dangerous path that I believe really tarnishes us in the long term. And notwithstanding that, what we do believe is that every single one of those people are entitled to due process, and that's what they are getting. And I also want to just note that in the last 2 months, and if we go back to early January, February, March, and if we sit through question period and many of the discussions, of course, our friend here, who consistently has maintained that there were 400, 600 people coming across, anticipated coming across the border every single day, and in fact, that was the assertion made by the Conservative opposition for a number of months, and lo and behold, we are looking at numbers where in April, which was the height of this issue, we had 83 asylum claims per day, not 400. In May, we had 57 asylum claims per day, and in June, we have 39. So in a sense, our numbers from April have been halved, reduced by 50% in the last 2 months, which is also represents the lowest number of asylum claims since last June. And the reason I say this is not because these numbers may go up and down, but the reason I say this is because a lot of what we're hearing is based on a great deal of hysteria and misinformation, and really, I think, trying to divide Canadians in terms of this issue. And I think it'll be very important that just getting to the motion, I think it's very important to study this issue. I think it is important to study it this summer, and we have no particular opposition against it. However, I would like to expand on Ms. Rempel's motion, notice of motion, and just like to amend it in order that we have a broader, more wholesome discussion on this issue. And therefore, Mr. Chair, if you will indulge me, I'd like to read an amended motion, I guess, at this point. And basically it reads, and please stop me, Mr. Clerk, if it's too fast, that pursuant to standing
just one
order,
moment. Do you have it in writing for the clerk, or you have another? You be able to give it to him? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration undertake a study to review the impact of irregular border crossings at Canada's southern border, including on some provinces and municipalities, that the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development be invited to appear before the committee for the purpose of the study, that this study be comprised of at least 2 meetings, and that this study be completed by no later than August 3rd, 2018. Excuse me,
Point of
Mr.
order.
Chair, if I may just
No,
finish
point
I
of
can hear a point of order first.
Thank you. Subsequent to the standing orders, I would argue that that is not an amendment of the motion. It's an entirely different motion. And I also believe that my colleague has not given notice of that motion. So I think that the language is very much different. The scope is different. I would argue that an amendment would be, who is appearing or at what time, but I would ask that you rule it out of order.
I won't rule it out of order. I believe it's an amendment that does 2 things. It amends, first, changing a word from the adequacy to the impact, and I believe it adds 2 ministers. So it expands it so it's not just the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, but also adds 2 other ministers to that. So I would rule that it is a fair amendment. It was read as a whole thing, but perhaps would be helpful if the member read out the amendments he actually wants to make in terms of the words that you're substituting for the words that are there.
Okay, Mr. Chair. So we're changing the word adequacy to impact. And
I believe to avoid the second use of the word impact, you've taken it out.
That's right. And I think we're saying, sorry, I'm looking at the original here.
And I heard you also added for specificity, après une semaine en français.
After a week in French, I've lost my English. It's terrible.
Some provinces and municipalities to expand it, and you've added 2 ministers. Is that correct?
That's
Am I
correct.
understanding
That's
correctly?
the substance of it.
So
And in fact, it's very much in line with what Ms. Kwan as well as Ms. Rempel were outlining. And just to conclude, Mr. Chair, I'm more or less done. Yeah, this is a very important issue. There's no question about it. I think collectively, I think the ministers All three ministers have been engaged on it from day one. Mr. Goodale has appeared here on a number of occasions and has outlined the precautions and the measures that he's taken, including the screening, both for health and security, and verification of identity. And I think that's essential to this conversation, as well as Minister Duclos has been seized with it from day one and ensuring that that there's adequate support for the different social needs of those who are coming across. And therefore, I think it's important that we do have the study. It is not a crisis as outlined. It is something that I think as a government we have addressed holistically, and it's an ongoing issue that we will. We've been reviewing on an ongoing basis, but I think this will give us an opportunity to set the record straight and to ensure that we're moving forward in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Point of clarification. So has my colleague opposite struck the timing of the committee?
No, it is still calling for 2 meetings before August the 3rd.
At least 2 meetings.
Should be 2 meetings. I just want to, just before we continue, Ms. Kwan asked for a copy in writing, and so the clerk has just gone, or the assistant has just gone out to get copies.
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to challenge your ruling.
Which ruling?
On the ruling that the amendment is in order. I think it's out of order for the reasons given by Ms. Rappel.
Okay. So that takes precedence. There's a challenge to my ruling, and I need to now. I normally step out of the chair to hear that. Is it debatable or not? No. Not debatable. Then I'm not going to really step out of the chair for that. All in favor of supporting my ruling? All opposed?
Mr. Chairman, I think you have to call them one by one.
You've asked for a recorded vote.
You've asked for a recorded
Yeah.
vote? Okay. A recorded vote? Is that normal?
Yeah, it's normal, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Sounds normal.
So we've had a request for a recorded vote by name. The clerk will now call the roll.
Ms. Alislev.
Agree?
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Yes.
Ms. Sarai. Yes. Ms. Tabara. Mr. Tabara. Sorry.
Yes.
Mr. Whalen.
Yes.
Mr. McGuire.
No.
Ms. Rempel.
No.
Mr. Tilson.
No.
Ms. Kwan.
Yes.
That passes 6-3, and my ruling is sustained. The amendment is in order. Just want to check, Ms. Kwan, is it a point?
Yes, it is a point. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What I was asking for was for Mr. Ananda Sangari to read out his motion once again, just so that, or his amendments once again, so that we can hear clearly where the changes were, because I wasn't quite following.
Okay, we'll do that, and then we'll start a speaker's list on the amendment.
And on the distribution of the amendments, I would like to just ask, is it translated into French also?
It is.
Fabulous. Thank you.
So would you read it slowly? There's an assistant gone to get copies of it, but yes.
The amendment reads, so the amended motion will read that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration undertake a study to review the impact of irregular border crossings at Canada's southern border, including on some provinces and municipalities, that the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, be invited to appear before the committee for the purpose of the study, that this study be comprised of at least 2 meetings, and that this study be completed by no later than August 3rd of 2018.
Point of clarification is, again, you know what, Mr. Chair, can we suspend briefly until we get a copy of this written? I need to see this.
Yep. My position is always if we have a request from a member to suspend. So the meeting will suspend for a few moments while we're waiting for a paper copy.
Given that we have quorum at the table, we'll proceed. Can you give me this here?
What do you want?
My paper on the top.
This?
Yes, and so I believe we're debating the substance of the amendment at this point. So I'd make a few. Jenny is on the list. Jenny as well. You're already on the list, Jenny. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, yes.
So I thought we just suspended for a few minutes.
Yes, but the chair left the room and we had quorum at the table, and I believe your colleague just said he'd like to make an airplane appointment. So I dispensed with the pleasantries so we could get on with business.
I'll assume the chair, please.
But
Thank
it will
you.
be pleasant.
We may continue.
And I may suspend the meeting at any moment, as is the chair's prerogative, just to allow members to know that. Whether there's a quorum in the room or not, it is the chair's prerogative to both open and close meetings and to suspend them. Thank you. We have a speaker's list on the amendment, which is an in-order amendment. Ms. Rempel.
So, Mr. Chair, my colleague opposite, the reason why I didn't support your ruling is I think that the word impact and adequacy actually has materiality to the scope of the study. And this is predicated because my colleague opposite used the term as part of his rationale that the plan from the government is quite clear. So I think in my opening arguments for the, in support of the original wording of the motion, we went through the amount of data that this committee is missing and the fact that the government has been making piecemeal announcements. To me, that would suggest that there isn't a plan. And in fact, between the time that I made my statement after Ms. Kwan did, I see a tweet from Rachel Aiello from CTV News that minutes before an emergency immigration meeting gets underway in Ottawa, feds announce without details that they will, quote, actively support Toronto through housing support for asylum seeker. Again, I mean, this is a member of the media, the press gallery, noting that there is no details to this. We have no idea how much of a funding commitment this is at all. And to me, this is just another example. And I mean, I think it's rather rich that the government is doing this while we're all sitting in this committee here. So for my colleague to make the argument that there is a plan, I really don't think anyone's buying that at this point. And I think that by sort of changing the language of the motion and suggesting that there is no plan outside of piecemeal announcements. And again, we've got a member of the press gallery who's noting that there was no details associated with it. I'll also note I received some information that the London city manager has been asked by a senior official in Toronto city manager, requesting if municipalities in Ontario had any appropriate, immediate available public or privately owned sites or facility, including hotels, which could be used for repurposed as shelter spaces for refugees or asylum claimants. Why is the mayor or the city manager of Toronto asking this question? Who's paying for hotel costs? Who's paying for these things? This is not information that's been provided to this committee. This is not information that has been provided at any point in time to any parliamentarian, and it's these sorts of things that the public starts going, okay, well, you know, where's the detail? Now, I want to, just because the issue of language came up, I would like to quote the immigration minister on March 19th in this committee of 2018. I'm happy to use illegal. I have used the word illegal, and I have used the word irregular, and I think both are accurate. I have no qualms using the term. So given that two of my colleagues in here have brought this up, in a way I think to divert from the issue, and that is that yes, people have the ability to claim asylum in Canada, but the reality is, according to the CBSA, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Immigration, they are illegally entering the country. So I just take issue with the government side. You know, I understand my colleague from the NDP has to do this, but for the government trying to divert away from the fact that there isn't a plan by contradicting themselves over and over again. And I think Canadians are at the point where they also understand the motivation for having this debate on semantics. And I guess if the minister was here, I would ask him if he's now contradicting himself with the statement that he made in committee, especially after he cast aspersions at our new colleague who's the immigration minister in Ontario. The other thing that I really want to take issue with is my colleague's characterization of the response to this issue as hysteria. Look, as a woman, I can't tell you the number of times I've been told I was hysterical. And I think for the government to say that asking questions about whether or not this policy is now normalized, that the government, we don't have a clear answer. I mean, we don't understand if the government is, what they will do. My colleagues from the NDP is saying, let's suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. I'm making the argument that we should allow it to continue regardless. The government has not stated its policy on this. They're just hoping that everyone will turn a blind eye. What I am arguing for and the reason why I'm arguing against the amendment is that this government has made a significant policy change. By not responding, they have responded, and they have said through their actions, by setting up a permanent space at Roxham Road, permanent processing agents, permanent transport plans, tent cities, by asking municipal leaders to look at busing people to different homeless shelters, they have made a decision that they are not going to enforce the Safe Third Country Agreement across the entire border. They're not taking, they're just saying, look, we're going to just enforce it at official points of entry, but we're not going to suspend it. There's been no public response on costing for this, or service delivery plans, or plans for integration. And with that, it's not reflected in the levels plan either. So there's no possible way that resettlement service providers can respond to this. So it's not about the impact, it is about the adequacy of the response, because the government does not have a plan to date. My colleague also, and just, just on the term of hysteria, like, again, that's a very gendered term to use, Gary, first of all. And I think very, very few Canadians would argue that a parliamentary committee studying the costs associated with the government's policy change is something that is hysterical. I don't understand why the Liberals' response to this has been to ratchet up words like fear of division and hysterical and spending all this time on the terminology illegal when they had their minister sit here and testify to the same months ago. Now, I want to refute some of the points that my colleague also made with regard to the adequacy of the minister's the level of information that the government has provided to this committee. My colleague opposite in his arguments for the amendment seemed to suggest that the minister has provided Parliament with any sort of information around the numbers expected, the details of the needs and competencies of the cohort that are crossing Roxham Road, of any of the meetings that he's had with provinces with regard to the long-term welfare costs associated with this. And I would just say, put this aside for a minute. It is not, it is our jobs to ask these questions, and we just don't have that information here. So again, we actually can't assess the impact because we don't understand the data that we don't even know if it is adequate, because there is no plan. I don't even know what this is. So the last couple of things that I want to talk about is the due process. This government and my colleague opposite used some language suggesting that what they are getting is due process. But is it really adequate or is it really accurate to suggest that somebody who is claiming asylum in Canada, that it's likely will take years to have an asylum claim heard? And we've got the Immigration Refugee Board in the news today talking about what a crisis situation they're in. That is due process. I mean, this is part of, again, the fact that we can't look at the impact of a plan because there isn't one. There isn't. I want to see the adequacy of a response. My colleague also said, he made a comment about the 400 per day. That wasn't a figure, Mr. Chair, that I put out. That was a figure that the Quebec government put out. So the Quebec government had done some analysis and looked at the current increase rate, and they were projecting 400 per day. Then my colleague suggested that 39 people per day is somehow a victory when it is actually more than June of last year. So again, I feel like the government is normalizing through their members here on this committee a situation that has become very difficult. I think that's really dangerous. I don't think that without having an accurate costed plan that is presented to Canadians, because I don't feel that the government did have a mandate to change their policy on this to such a great extent. I do worry about people asking, well, maybe, you know, maybe immigration isn't working right now. He also made a comment about the piles of homework that we've given IRCC officials, and he said, well, a vast majority of this was done. The staff, public servants exist at our pleasure to provide this information because we have a mandate from our constituents to scrutinize the expenditure of public funds. And vast majority is not acceptable. We still have outstanding requests from the CBSA. This is why my colleague Larry Maguire has asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer to do an analysis, because maybe they'll have more luck than we will. We don't understand if the government is even going to acquiesce to some of these requests. So, you know, in terms of piles of homework, that's their jobs. And I find it really difficult that, you know, every once in a while we have to threaten to, you know, raise points of privilege in here because it's months and months before we get any sort of costing information. The last point with regard to, you know, the minister providing adequate information to committee, he is going out and expending public funds without any scrutiny on an ongoing basis. And, you know, Safe Third Country Agreement aside, there are people in Canada right now, there are over 31,000 people in Canada who have come to Canada through Roxham Road, Manitou, Emerson, in the last year and a half. And how are we supporting them when they're here? Like, are we just going to continue busing them around to hotels without any sort of plan? How much is that going to cost? That's not fair. That's not right. Can you imagine somebody being in a college dorm in Toronto right now and reading the news articles, if you can read it, if you have that privilege to be able to read it, and finding out that August 9th you might not have a place to go? I mean, that's not a plan. I guess for me, and I understand why the Liberal members used the language that they did, because they're very, Mr. Chair, desperately trying to avoid scrutiny on this issue. But these are people's lives, and this is where the going gets tough, right? This is where the going gets tough. It's not about a photo op anymore, right? How welcoming is Canada? And that's a question this committee should be seized with. So I refuse, Mr. Chair, and I would ask my colleagues opposite to really think about implying that the government has a plan here and trying to whitewash this motion. To my colleague opposite, through you, Mr. Chair, I really think and I would ask him to retract the term hysterical, because I think that's what's going to be the clip tonight. And I really don't think that it behooves anyone in this room or in Canada or who've been coming to Canada, who have been crossing the road this way, to say that a parliamentary committee asking for answers and holding the government to account on this is hysterical or is anti-Canadian. This is our job. This is Canada right here. So I don't support the motion, and I would ask my colleagues opposite, and especially to implore up to, you know, the Prime Minister's right hands, you know, stop with this and actually get the ministers here and start holding them to account, because nobody buys this anymore and it's damaging to people's lives. So the amendment is poor. We should be supporting the main motion as worded. I think my colleague opposite already said from the NDP that she would support it in her opening remarks. And please don't try and soften this, because there isn't a plan, and that's something that I would hope the members acknowledge.
Mr. Tilson.
Just on 2 points, Mr. Chairman. My colleague doesn't like the word illegal. And I'm just going to quote again the question that I asked the minister at one of our former meetings. The question on border crossing from the United States, you've used the word irregular, but almost everyone else uses the word illegal. Mr. Cormier, Ms. Alislav, and others have used the word illegal. And the minister responded by saying, I'm happy to use the word illegal. And I responded, because it is illegal. In fact, there's a sign that's put up by the government on Roxham Road that says, stop. It's illegal to cross the border here or any other place through a port of entry. You will be arrested and detained if you cross here. I don't know what else. Again, I'm repeating what Ms. Rempel said. I think you're trying to soften the seriousness of this whole issue. And it's incredibly serious. We're concerned about the safety of our border. We're concerned about a whole slew of things. We also want to assist people who are waiting in refugee camps around the planet, who are facing persecution in dangerous places around the world and must wait longer as more and more resources are spent processing people crossing into Canada from the United States. We have, this committee went over to Africa because we're concerned about the camps there. Well, and we're continuing to work on that study. But this issue is taking away from the work that the government can be doing in other areas. As far as the word, my colleague says, oh, we have a plan. Well, again, Ms. Rempel has adequately described that. There clearly is no plan other than spending money. And even spending money is not being spent. Premier Ford has asked for $72 million to deal with the influx of asylum seekers. Mayors in other cities are worried about whether they're going to be shipped to their municipalities. My mayor in the town of Orangeville, a population of 30,000, is concerned about whether the town of Orangeville is going to be asked to house some of these asylum seekers. The issue is clearly out of control. And so I'm opposed to the amendment because it's clearly watering down the motion that was put by Ms. Rempel, and I think the amendment should be defeated.
Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to address a number of different points. I think, first off, on the issue around terminology, both my colleagues, Ms. Rempel and Mr. Tilson, are correct, what they read on the record. And I remember that meeting like as it was yesterday because I was genuinely upset at the fact that the minister capitulated and in fact said on the public record that illegal, using the word illegal to describe asylum seekers is the same as describing them as irregular. And I call on the minister to correct that terminology, to retract the misusage of the word illegal in this context. And in fact, subsequent to that, Mr. Chair, in the House of Commons, when we were dealing with the budget debate, I raised that issue with the minister again as well. He ignored it, did not answer the question, but I did note that his terminology did change and that he used irregular and did not use the word illegal since that time. Now, I also note that in the House of Commons in question period, the Prime Minister himself used the word illegal to describe asylum seekers, and I was very upset about that as well, and I rose in the House of Commons afterwards, after question period, and raised a point of order and call on the Prime Minister to retract the usage of that word and to apologize for it, which of course he didn't do. So when this happens, it does not help the situation. When the government themselves use the wrong terminology. And it allows for people to move to this space to talk about this very important issue as somehow it's about semantics. It's not just about semantics. These words have real meanings, and they are very different when you call somebody illegal versus somebody who's doing something that's irregular. And I think we can all know that. I am not an expert on the English language by any stretch of the imagination. I'm an ESL student, you know, and but I'll tell you, I know the difference between illegal versus irregular. It was inappropriate for the government to make that statement for the minister and for the Prime Minister, and now we are caught out in this situation. I do hope that they will find the time to actually state on the public record very clearly by retracting the usage of those words so we can get on with the situation of dealing with the matter. Now, I also heard Mr. Tilson say this as well, that government, that they are a lot of people, and he's right in the sense that there are a lot of people across the globe that are in need of resettlement support because people are displaced for a whole variety of reasons. He's absolutely correct to say that. But let us not conflate the different streams of settlement and resettlement, Mr. Chair. The folks under the government-assisted program, under that stream, the refugees who come under that stream is entirely different from the stream of inland refugees. The levels plan actually indicate that, Mr. Chair. By accepting inland refugees, which under the levels plan is called the protected persons in Canada and dependents abroad class, they are different streams. Accepting more people under that stream does not take away the stream of government-assisted refugees, Mr. Chair, or the privately sponsored refugees for that matter. They are different streams, and I wish that people will not conflate these different avenues to access resettlement support here in Canada. Because when you do that, when you conflate those streams, you are creating confusion, misrepresentation, and fear in the hearts and minds of people, as though somehow one group of people is queue jumping over another, taking an advantage of someone else at the expense of someone else, when in fact it is not the case, and that's not how Canada's immigration system is set up. On the issue around the amendment, I will say this. I think it is important to look at the impact, absolutely. And I also think that it is important, if it's not generally accepted when you look at the impact, that you're also looking at the response to that impact. If it is not generally accepted that is the intent behind this motion, and perhaps I can get a clarification from Gary on this. If the intent is not to look at the government's response to the impact, then I do think that we need to add those words in. And I would say to add in the words after the word the impact and the government's response, so that we can be clear. Right? When you look at the impact, you are looking at the response as well, because how else can you look at the impact if you don't look at the response? And perhaps, just to be clear in moving forward in an effort to address the concerns that Ms. Rempel had, that somehow this is meant to sidestep looking at the response, we can actually put those words in there. And I would perhaps move this as a friendly amendment to this amendment to the motion by adding and the government's response after the word impact, Mr. Chair.
Because our procedure doesn't allow friendly amendments, we'll take that as a sub-amendment, an amendment to the amendment.
All right.
And is there any discussion on the sub-amendment?
If I could finish, then I will move that as a sub-amendment to the amendment, just to be very clear then.
Very good.
So I think the purpose here is to really to get on with the study so that we can look at the issue. And then we can, coming out of that process, determine whether or not it's adequate. I have a view about that.
Maybe
Ms.
you can
Rempel has a view about that, and then we can let the study take its course, Mr. Chair.
Yes, so the sub-amendment is inserting the words "and the government's response" following the word "the impact." So between the impact and of regular, so it's the impact or the impact of and the government's response to. Would that be okay?
Correct,
I think
yes.
the impact of and the government's response to irregular border crossings.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that I do want to raise on this motion, I'm a little bit disturbed.
Okay, I think we now have a
we have to
sub-amendment
vote
on
on
the
this,
floor.
and then I'll come back to the
So
point?
if there's
Sure.
any discussion about the sub-amendment, seeing none, all in favor of the sub-amendment? Any opposed? That's carried. Okay, now you can continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Now, I'm a little bit disturbed, and I hope that this is will be accepted as a sub-amendment as well. The words "be invited" is included in here. Normally, in our motions, we invite the minister to appear, right? Then our motions normally just simply say that the Minister of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship appear before the committee. It is not to say that we invite, because what I'm worried is that if we make the invitation, they say, well, I'm too busy, I can't come. Then we have done our job, we've accommodated this motion, but then we actually didn't achieve the result of having the minister here. So I would ask that we strike the words, "be invited," and simply "be invited to strike those words, and simply for it to say for these different ministers to appear before the committee, Mr. Chair. And then that, I think, will set aside potential concerns that if an extension, if the invitation has been extended, that it has satisfied this motion, even if the ministers are not available to come to the committee.
I'd just like to take a moment to consult with the clerk on that. One second. I've consulted with the clerk, and it is the normal procedure of this committee, since I've been here, to invite. That's the words we have used in the past. However, there is apparently no substantive difference between inviting and requesting, and that there's no difference in that if it makes someone feel better. So, the sub-amendment is in order to strike the words "be invited to," and so the line would read that the minister of blah 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 appear before. But the impact is still an invitation will be extended to them. So, any discussion about that? All in favor? Opposed?
It's carried.
The chair will decide when it carries or not. Thank you very much. Did everyone vote that wanted to vote have a chance to vote?
Mr. Chairman, the vote was closed. One vote went up.
I didn't close the vote.
What were you doing? You
I
said
did not
all
close
those
the vote.
opposed.
Who voted
One
against?
hand went up.
Mr.
and that's
Tilson,
it.
you're out of order now, unless you have a point and want to challenge the chair. May I ask all in favor? Any opposed? It is carried with one against.
To make regarding this amendment. Given the fact that the amendment has included 2 additional ministers, so for a meeting of 2 hours, having 3 ministers and 3 sets of officials, department officials, come, I think would stretch our time, Mr. Chair, so that we can adequately pursue our discussion. And so I would like to make a suggestion, although not an amendment to the motion, but a suggestion to say that when we set this meeting, that we could extend that meeting to a 3-hour meeting as opposed to a 2-hour meeting, so that we can accommodate 3 ministers and 3 sets of officials more adequately, Mr. Chair. If there's a requirement for me to incorporate that as a sub-amendment to the motion, I'm happy to do so. But if not, if it's understood that that is what we would do and committee members agree with that approach, then I'm happy to leave that out.
I've just consulted with the clerk, and he said, especially in the summer when the House is not sitting and we're not constricted with times of other committee meetings, we can use that. So depending on the number of witnesses that are requested in general, we'll be able to move that. But I get the point that we'll still have at least 2 meetings, so maybe 3 meetings, which could happen in one day. Or it could be, so we'll have that. I would appreciate the flexibility. I get the point. I think that's the will of the committee, is to have a thorough and exhaustive, if not exhausting, meeting.
Thank you very much. Then on that basis, Mr. Chair, I will support the amendment that's been put forward by Mr. Anasanguri with the sub-amendments that I had also tabled in the passage of the sub-amendment, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to add a bit of French to this meeting after the French that you spoke earlier. Well, listen, currently, I can't vote, obviously, but I can recommend my colleagues to not support the amendment. Our motion was well balanced. Our motion didn't include the word illegal. There was no mention of illegal in what was asked. The government party wants to play on rhetoric, to focus on, to add irregular, to force the opposition to vote against it. I don't know if the Immigration Committee has already worked on Roxanne, but I went for public safety twice. Once without invitation. I went with my staff to the American side. I went to the access point. I have a good photo here that clearly shows that it is illegal to cross the border, to cross into Canada. And also people from the RCMP came to meet with me. I introduced myself, and they told me I couldn't cross, and my staff went forward, and immediately the police officer said, "Stop, it's illegal." So as an MP, as political staffers, we were clearly identified and told not to enter Canada. So why are we playing with words? The people who are listening to us and who are watching at home we're being paid to talk, and what they wanted is a plan. And then there was the idea of including the Minister of Public Safety, the Minister of Family. Yes, it would be a pleasure to invite them back and have Minister Goodale here to talk about the issue. But to add to playing with words, to forcing the members of the opposition to vote against us, because for our thing is clear that it is illegal to cross the border illegally. And we need to control our borders. The management of asylum seekers is another issue to be managed, but the very act of crossing remains illegal, and it is clearly written, regardless of what our colleague from the NDP might say. So what I would ask is that we resolve this situation. We have meetings. We remove this component to have a unanimous vote from everyone so that we can move forward, because millions of Canadians are wondering what we're doing here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is no one else on the list for the amendment, so I'm going to call the question then on voting on the amendment to the motion. Would you like it read? A recorded vote has been requested. So this is on the amendment, which has been sub-amended already. So the amended motion, the amendment to the motion is that we replace the words "the adequacy of the federal government's response to the impact of increased asylum seekers crossing into Canada from the United States" with the words "the impact and the government's response to the impact of and the government response to the irregular border crossing at Canada's southern border, including on some provinces and municipalities." And the second amendment being that after the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, we insert the words "the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness" and "the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development." Those are the two amendments which are part of that one amendment as amended through the sub-amendment. All in favor then of the amendment?
Recorded division.
Oh, recorded division, sorry. Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Aleslev.
Agreed.
Mr. Anandansagiri.
Yes.
Mr. Sarai.
Yes.
Mr. Tabara. Yes. Mr. Whalen.
Yes.
Mr. McGuire,
No.
Ms. Rempel,
No.
Mr. Tilson,
No.
Ms. Kwan,
Yes.
That passes 6-3. We're now returning now to the original motion now as amended and sub-amended. I have Ms. Rempel on the list.
I'm fine, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Paulus, vous êtes dans la liste aussi?
Mr. Paulus, you're on the list as well. No, thank you.
No.
Mr. Tilson?
Pass.
Okay. Seeing no other speakers, I'm going to call a question. I'm assuming you'd like a recorded division as well?
Yes.
Mr. Clerk?
on the main motion, Ms. Alice Lev,
Yes.
Mr. Ananda Sangari,
Yes.
Mr. Sarai,
Yes.
Mr. Tabara,
Yes.
Mr. Whalen,
Yes.
Mr. McGuire,
Yes.
Ms. Rempel,
Yes.
Mr. Tilson,
Yes.
Ms. Kwan,
Yes.
Okay.
He said yes.
The only person who can say yes like this. One last point of business then is that I'd just like to note that we will be then having at least 2 meetings prior to August the 3rd. That meeting will include a request to ministers to attend as well as officials, as is our case, as well as witnesses. And so I'm going to ask that witnesses be, as a list of witnesses be submitted to the clerk no later than 5:00 p.m. on Wednesday of this week, so that we can continue as expeditiously as possible with the committee's desire to have 2 meetings. Ms. Kwan.
Just for clarification, in terms of witnesses, how many witnesses should we be submitting? Because there is that allocation issue, and I'm just wondering whether or not we're going to be following the allocation approach,
Yes.
or is there a different approach?
So my assumption is, since I've been on this committee, that we'll follow the allocation approach, and we will have 60% of the witnesses, as recommended, please, in a ranked way from the Liberal Party, 30% in a ranked way, please, from the Conservative Party, and 10% from the New Democratic Party. The number of witnesses, I just need a little bit of leeway. I will try to let you know as soon as I can. I'm going to try to work out. We have, thank you, only one of our analysts with us today. I want to look at the lay of the land with our acting clerk as well, to try to figure out how many meetings we can get in. It's subject a little bit to when ministers are available. You've requested 3 ministers in the summer to attend. I need some flexibility to work around their schedules, which I'm sure we have a very strict time limit on this. I am suspecting we'll get around 10 witnesses. It could be a few more, it could be a few less, but around 10 witnesses will be what we have, given the fact that you've asked for a minimum of 2 meetings. Ms. Rempel.
Given that 3 ministerial statements in one hour block wouldn't leave a lot of time for questions, I would ask that you have them each at one separate meeting, and that we would have this study would expand. Otherwise, members won't be able to allow questions, and it would just be a government talking point festival.
I will do my best to see how much time we can give. I know that your time is valuable. I'm
though.
going to respect the motion you just passed and attempt to do our best to accommodate all your needs.
Actually, so Mr. Chair, then I would move that the ministers appear not in one block, and that they would be separated out, so that we
Point
can
of order,
respect
Mr. Chair. We've just passed this motion.
I'm moving
If
another
the-
motion.
If Ms. Rempel wants to move another motion, I guess we can debate it at another meeting.
We have lots of time, Mr. We only have 15 minutes.
So I think I know the answer on this. I always like to check with the clerk. Just one moment, please. So yes, my instinct was that because this is still on the topic of the meeting called under 106.4, that I will allow, but I'd just like you to repeat the motion that you would like to have made.
Sure. So, Mr. Chair, just as sort of preamble to this, given the scope of information that this committee is going to require and the scope of information that each of these ministers cover, as would be the norm with estimates, we would usually give an hour block to each minister. So I would move that an hour block be allocated to each minister separately rather than having them all appear at one hour meeting, so that so I'm just thinking out loud here on how to word this. I would move that to your discretion in terms of scheduling, but that each of the ministers that we've been invited to apply or appear be given one separate 1 hour block each in order to maximize the amount of time available for questions.
We'll just get a speaker's list. I got Mr. Tilson so far. Anybody else? Mr. Tilson?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. If we recall when Mr. Sen and Mr. Goodall appeared, that was for 1 hour. And I don't know what everybody else thought. I found that very inadequate, Mr. Chairman, dividing 1 hour. That's with 2 ministers. So I shudder what it would be like with 3 ministers. We might get a question for each minister. I'm exaggerating, but you know, if they each speak for 5, 10 minutes or 8 minutes, whatever your ruling is, you know, that doesn't leave much time to ask questions of those ministers, which would be the whole purpose of the meeting, is to have them clarify what their plan is for this issue. And so I think hopefully members will agree with Ms. Rempel's motion that 1 hour for 3 is inadequate, and preferably there should be 1 hour for each minister.
Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think that was my intent when I said for us to turn our meeting into a 3-hour meeting so that we can accommodate the 3 ministers accordingly and their officials accordingly. I'm happy to support this motion for it to be formalized, but at the same time, I want to ensure, of course, that, Mr. Chair, you have some flexibility to ensure that the ministers can appear before our committee.
Ms. Rempel?
Again, if we are going to go through the time and effort of having a study on this issue, it's incumbent upon us, and I would just ask government members, I think the optics of voting down this request, especially since we're giving the chair the authority to schedule at his discretion, would be pretty poor for the government side. There are a lot of questions to answer, and 3 government statements at 10 minutes a pop really doesn't leave a lot of time for opposition questions. I don't imagine that the government members would be particularly hard-hitting on this, so I would like to have more than 1 round with each minister, and that's really what this amounts to. So I would ask that they put the issue of optics aside, and if we are going to go through the expense and effort of this study, to support this motion.
Mr. Anand Sangri.
Mr. Chair, I know it's customary when you have more than 1 minister, oftentimes the time slots are reduced. So I know typically, if I'm not mistaken, we're in a 10-minute time slot. So other committees have done this by reducing from, say, 10-minute to a 7-minute or a 6-minute with a written statement, and most ministers do have written remarks. So I do believe that could be done. I mean, oftentimes there's quite a bit of follow-up, as I indicated earlier, from these engagements as well. So I'm sure the minister's offices will be able to follow up after that with written responses.
Mr. Wayland and Ms. Rempel.
I'm happy to leave this in the chair's discretion when he schedules the meetings, and I think that's the most appropriate way to deal with it for all the reasons that have been already provided.
Ms. Rempel.
So just for folks who might be watching, what we're talking about here, Mr. Chair, is that when you have 3 ministers come, there's 3, and especially given the scope of the ministers, you have the Minister of Immigration responsible for processing and coming up with policies on how many people are coming into the country and under what circumstances. The Minister of Public Safety, who would be looking at the security of Canada's borders and screening, as well as the Minister of Employment, which is essentially all of the social programs in government, to allocate in one hour block approximately 7 minutes for the opposition to ask questions of all of those 3 ministers in one meeting is wholly inadequate, and I firmly believe that the optics on this would be an effort on behalf of the government to not allow transparency in this issue, which is wrong. And I also believe, Mr. Chair, that the comment that my colleague opposite just made, that don't worry, the ministers will follow up with you, is particularly not believable given the debacle that happened with the immigration minister in Winnipeg on Friday. I don't think anyone believes that they would just follow up with us after we've almost had to move parliamentary privilege motions to get bits and dribs and drabs of information out of the departments, often months later. Thanks but no thanks on that line of questioning. Mr. Chair, I know that your intent will be to schedule as efficiently as possible. But if the government, again, just for people that are watching, if the government votes against this motion, what they are essentially saying is that they would prefer to have 3 ministers give protracted statements and not allow with advertising government talking points so that opposition members can't ask questions of them. Thank you.
I'm just following the argument here. The Liberal side made an amendment to include a broader study with other ministers. It was voted against by the other side, but you want more time with them. I just want to clarify.
Clarification, you ascribed motive to my rejection of the amendment that was not supported in my argument.
You supported the motion as amended.
I argued against the amendment because I believe that the information put forward, or the argument put forward by Mr. Ananda Sangari was predicated on his assertion that the government had a plan. Okay. So, I'd ask you to retract that that particular statement.
I wasn't asserting it. I'm trying to sort out how we're trying to word this. I like to get the intent of the committee so that I can make sure that we follow through exactly as closely to the will of the committee as possible.
Well, I would find it somewhat out of character for a chair to ascribe motive.
I wasn't ascribing motive.
Well, I thank you for your retraction of that assertion.
Not ascribing motive.
Thank you.
We have a motion on the floor that we have 3 one-hour blocks of time within our 2 meetings, minimum of 2 meetings.
No, that isn't what the motion said. At least 2 meetings.
At least 2 meetings, but yes, we have at least 2 meetings. But within those at least 2 meetings, we would have 3 one-hour blocks of time for ministers. Okay. All in favor of that? Do you want this on division as well, or no?
Sure.
Here on division?
Why not?
Great for Facebook.
I mean, by recorded division?
Yes. And emails to offices after.
Ms. Alice Leb.
No.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
No.
Mr. Sarai.
No.
Mr. Tabara.
No.
Mr. Whalen.
No.
Mr. McGuire.
Yes.
Ms. Rempel.
Yes.
Mr. Tilson.
Yes.
Ms. Kwan.
Yes.
So that is defeated, 5-4. Just a note to the committee, I get the intent of this is to make sure the committee has enough time for several things. You're allotting enough time for ministers, for officials, and for witnesses. And in our limited amount of time, I will do the best to make sure that we have all of those covered.
Point of clarification, Mr. Chair, you actually missed a fairly important thing in that, and that was that opposition members be allowed to have time to ask questions of ministers. So I think that you actually conveniently left that out, and I would like to know what your intent is in terms of scheduling out ministers such that, well, first of all, if you think that that is important, and then how you plan to achieve that.
I will send out a notice of meeting, and you'll see the agenda based on the motions that have been passed
But just
today.
point of clarification, since you just did summarize what you thought the committee thought was important, Do you agree or
I
disagree?
will also add in the questioning of, I'm assuming ministers, witnesses, and officials that are important to all parties.
And just so that the committee is clear, what would you consider adequate time for opposition members with that number of ministers?
I'm very pleased that the committee has a process whereby minutes of questioning has been allocated to each of the parties appropriately. That is passed as a working principle of this committee, and we will follow that.
So just to clarify, in terms of if you were to schedule 3 ministers in one hour block, that would leave approximately 1 7-minute round each for the opposition members?
I had no idea what the outcome of this meeting would be today, so I'm going to take this back, and I will work with the analysts and the clerk to ensure that the motions that were passed today are appropriately followed. And I believe that the committee would have always had appropriate time based on the structures that we have passed. Ms. Kwan and Mr. Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I note that the motion that Ms. Rempel moved failed. I don't normally do this, but we did have an offside conversation, Mrs. Chair. I had an offside conversation with you just now about adding the ministers and my concern about the adequacy of our meeting, our normal 2-hour block meeting, to accommodate that. And I made a suggestion off the record to say that if we can have a 3-hour meeting so that we can accommodate those 3 ministers accordingly, that would be, I think, to everyone's advantage. The goal of the work of the committee is to get the information, and then also for committee members to ask questions as well, and hopefully to work towards a solution that we can all agree on, although that may or may never happen, but that is still the goal here. So I hope that you will undertake to do exactly that. And the ministers, I hope that they will understand the importance of this work, why committee members from all sides of the House have decided that we would come back in the middle of summer, taking time away from our constituency as well as our family to do this work, and I hope that they will accommodate us accordingly.
And I believe I responded to you in the affirmative, and my mind has not changed, despite attempts to change it.
It is so good to have that on the record. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other business related to, Mr. Maguire?
Yeah, and just thanks, Mr. Chair. And so then I think Canadians deserve to have, if we're going to have 3 ministers, 3 hours. However you put it together is, you have a chairmanship role to play in that. But I think Canadians expect that there'll be some obvious times for questioning on this to get some of the answers that they don't think are happening today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other business? The meeting's adjourned.